Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for enjoying us this evening in person and on Zoom. We're here at Alfred University in the Holmes Auditorium. I'm Miles Calvert, the director of the IEA. We'll be hearing more about that momentarily. I wear a second hat. I'm president of SGCI, Southern Graphics Council International, who are our generous co-hosts for this evening. Most of them will be on Zoom because they're spread across the globe. As a representative of the board, we are beyond excited to welcome Ericka Walker for her artist talk this evening and to create an edition or two or three within the IEA during her 2-week residency here. This programming is printmaking specific, but it's also an opportunity for the masses to engage with contemporary working artists who are clear leaders in their field. I encourage all of you to attend the SGCI conference in October of 2027 in Pittsburgh. You'll all find conference details and open calls for exchanges, portfolio exchanges, excursions, and other opportunities on the SGCI website. I'm going to pass the moderation of the evening now on to Shahana and Mac, 2 undergraduate BFA students participating in the Business of Art class. Thank you very much for your attendance this evening and enjoy the talk.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this event organized by the Institute for Electronic Arts, part of the School of Art and Design at Alfred University. The IEA is dedicated to supporting contemporary artists through its primary focus on residency programs. These residencies provide artists with the opportunity to engage in vital research using electronic media, new technologies, and print media within fine arts disciplines, while also benefiting local, regional, and global communities. In addition to residencies, the IEA supports evolving electronics studio research labs, hosts national and international conferences, and encourages projects in experimental media, arts, print, and publications. The IEA residencies and public engagement are thanks to the Shine Joseph Endowment and the New York State Council for the Arts. You can learn much about the IEA since its founding in 1997 via our website and social media platforms. This talk is being moderated by myself, Shahana Podar, and my co-host, Michaela Day. We are students at Alfred University participating in the Business of Art class.
We are very excited to introduce Ericka Walker as our artist in residence at the IEA. Ericka has been at Alfred since March 16th and will continue her residency until March 29th. Though currently residing in Atlantic Canada, Ericka is originally from southern Wisconsin. She is a visual artist specializing in print media and site-specific murals. Her work has been exhibited widely throughout North America and internationally, with pieces in both public and private collections. Her work draws from history, often emulating 20th century propaganda, encouraging critical thinking about the media we are exposed to. She is currently an associate professor in fine arts at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. At the moment in the IEA, she is working on woodblock prints. She can be found online at erickawalker.com. We plan on hearing from our artist for roughly the next 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A session. Please use the chat feature if you are joining us via Zoom, as we also have an in-person audience. Thank you everyone who is joining us, and thank you to Ericka Walker for your time this evening.
Good evening, Alfred Arts community. And good evening, virtual print community. Where am I looking at you right now? I think I am. They're in that camera, right? Thank you, you guys nailed it. Good job. Thank you for taking your evening to be with me here, to listen to me, or morning for that person in Australia that might be there. Yeah, what an honor. Thank you for showing up and giving me your time. The IEA residency, the Institute for Electronic Arts at Alfred. Wow, I'm really, I'm preceded by some of my favorites and some of the, as you guys said, leading artists in the field. I've had my eye on this residency for a long time, and it's been an excellent experience. Thank you, SGCI, for all that you do, all the officers, all the volunteers, everybody that makes this community an excellent one to be a part of, for hosting this presentation. Miles and Brig, you two are amazing collaborators. Miles Calvert and Brig Bogue have come together with me to collaborate on this piece that we're making upstairs on the 4th floor. I hope that any of you here that want to see more will come give a knock or peek in the window, and maybe we'll like keep the door propped for the next few days. Please come up and see what we're doing. You guys have given this wonderful balance between like professionalism and skill, and also like a great lightness and levity. It's been really a real fun time to work with you all. William Contino, Jiawen Chen, and Catherine Vajda, thank you for sharing the studio with me, for creating an enviable print program. I am forgetting, I have the list. Oh, thank you to my colleagues back in Nova Scotia for covering for me while I'm gone. Did I get it? Okay, God. So IEA, this residency, real briefly before I start, giving artists access to all of this technology, all of this expertise, to your students, staff, faculty. I've met some wonderful people and had some really special conversations. That's what a university should be doing. Institutes like this are so golden, such a great opportunity for all of us. So congratulations for keeping it going, really important. That is my intro. So this whole presentation, it's a really broad look at my career, not a real deep dive. I think that's a good place to be for an educational institution. So content warning. Violence, lots of violence, military violence, colonial violence. If you are having a hard time with the bleakness of the world right now, this might not be a good presentation for you. I think it's punctuated with some light moments, and it finishes on a really happy note, if that helps. I also mention difficult experiences that veterans have returning home. So. Let there be light, fiat lux, excelsior, ever upward. Those are the New York State motto and the Alfred University motto. I'm really interested in mottos and these encapsulations that are quite grandiose. And that is a picture of me from earlier today in Belfast, New York, doing a little research trip with Brig. And the mural behind me on that Legion says, America, land of the free, home of the brave. That's how I do field work. So I grew up on the traditional tribal lands of the Ho-Chunk and Potawatomi. This land is governed through dozens of land cession treaties and is also known as Wisconsin. I currently live on Kijipanupek near Chibuktuk in Mi'kma'ki, a region which was never ceded to British or French settlers. This place is also known as St. Margaret's Bay, Nova Scotia in Atlantic Canada. And I'm grateful to be a guest on Onondaga territory. I'm a settler. I'm a daughter of colonialism, an occupier, a descendant of uninvited guests, a beneficiary of this ongoing imperial colonial experiment. I'm also other things, but I think that's a really important place to start for a presentation that focuses so heavily on origin stories and cultural heritage. So the first third of this presentation, I'm going to talk about my emerging career because I think it provides some really interesting context for what I'm up to right now. And the last 2/3, I'll finish up with recent work and work in progress. So the bulk of my studio practice for the first decade were these large lithographic posters that emulate early 20th century European and American integration propaganda and advertising posters. So I did this in service of reflecting on my origins and examining how structures of power mobilized propaganda and pageantry to lay a place for my ancestors, for me, and for my children. So for about 2 decades in the studio, I've been interested in questioning the difficulty and complexity of honoring heritage and locating the ways in which national identity are formed, and generally just probing around and then questioning this messy, weird, slippery territory of patriotism. And this work really began with a lot of questions, with a lot of tension, a lot of uncertainty. And I think those are really good platforms for studio practice. So if I were running for office, speaking of birthrights or heritage, if I were up here right now campaigning, the first thing I would tell you was my mother is the daughter of a first-generation Serbo-Croatian American woman, a caregiver, a mother, a homemaker who took up the call to work in the factories during World War II. My mother's father was a Chicago steel mill worker and a veteran of the European theater during World War II, also a first-generation Serbo-Croatian. My father, descended from a private in the Revolutionary War, was the son of Illinois farmers who went to college on the GI Bill after returning home injured towards the end of his tour in Vietnam. My parents were both public school teachers and committed volunteers in their community and abroad. And that would be my introduction to you. And you'd think, oh, what a wholesome, salt of the earth Midwesterner. And I recoil from this dumb oversimplification of my identity. But I'd be lying if I denied that I'm also proud. And I'm very deeply indebted to that story. Other ancestors were escaping political regimes and their own economic failure. Everyone was looking to avail themselves of the American dream to scrape together something better. And so they crossed an ocean to escape with a vision of starting a new and better story. And this is a beautiful reality of my ancestors. I began working on these posters with this in mind. I was entwined with an origin story of which I was unmistakably proud. But on the other hand, this story of my family can be told through a lens of capitalist patriarchy and white supremacy. The official records of my family's papers make little mention of the ownership of other humans in the form of chattel slavery. They make little mention of the women who would become subsumed into another family's name, who were groomed to believe that their highest and only aspirations were to marry, manage a home to the design of their husbands, and produce offspring. They don't mention who was displaced from the land that would be cleared and cultivated to grow popcorn and to graze sheep. And little of how the young men in this family would be told a story of duty, manhood, bravery that would seduce them into enlisting to the ends that they bloodied their hands and brought nightmares home. So the stories I inherited, the visual culture, the songs, the lessons were deeply flawed, full of omission at best, and responsible for the perpetuation of harm. And so that is, in short, the studio question I began with. Can I critically examine what I've inherited while also touching the richness of that heritage? I was making works that wedge themselves somewhere in between French philosopher Jacques Ellul's definition of the two types of propaganda. So the first, integration propaganda, aims at convincing people of the benefits of adjusting themselves to desired patterns or ways of thinking, often state-sponsored. And the second, agitation propaganda, which serves the purpose of inciting rebellion. So between those two opposing modes is a space in which persuasion can't effectively exist, and my work has been described that way as occupying an absurdist space or an odd liminal space where the very function of a poster, which is to deliver a message very quickly and succinctly, is entirely crippled. So without its ability to perform as expected, this could open up a platform to reconsider or attach new meaning, ideally. So all the text in these pieces comes from political speeches, original slogans from 20th century posters, editorial essays from the 18th and 19th century, quotes from military generals, the 9/11 Commission report, the Canadian Armed Forces report on sexual harassment in the military, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So these words are also my medium, as is lithography, which I won't get too deep into this evening. You can ask questions during the Q&A if you would like. So in this work's best moments, when a viewer realizes that they're not looking at state-sponsored propaganda, nor are they looking at a protest piece, there could be a search for meaning, an attempt to connect the image and the slogan. And if I'm really lucky, people might see that although the vehicle and the aesthetics have changed over the years, the strategies used in propaganda have essentially stayed the same. For example, while the amount of allegorical illustration has been dialed back over the years, the same sentiments are being evoked here. The language is similar. What they want to incite in us is the same. Both of these attempt to kindle a generic attraction to belonging to something large, noble, and adventurous. The only difference is that the poster on the left is hand-drawn, and it's overtly racist, but it's British, so it's civil, because sometimes inclusivity is convenient. Technical gear and stoic masculinity being equated with heroism, catering here to the indomitable individual spirit serving a noble cause. And last I heard, individualism is a concept that doesn't work very well in active duty service. Staring with great confidence into the void, apparently the mark of a real leader. So early on, and throughout my time with these posters, I'd begin with a machine or a piece of technology, And in graphic art and propaganda, the machine is typically a stand-in for progress or innovation. I had worked in fields like construction and in metal foundries where knowledge about machinery held this interesting hierarchical place. So whether it was contemporary or historic machines and technology, that kind of knowledge held this very masculine mystique. So it's been suggested that with this work, maybe I was finally ready to critique the masculine prowess that had been surrounding me since childhood. Perhaps, I don't know. With these early works, I got a bit cheeky, attaching rocket launchers and artillery to farm equipment. As it evolved, the specificity of the machinery became more intentional. I had been exploring the development of contemporary agriculture and the agricultural revolution that helped propel settlement on this continent. I was learning about threads that connect agriculture with the military-industrial complex, with imperial and colonial aggression, and the inventions that made it possible for European settlers to spread westward and cultivate the prairies. So I was digging deeper into my own family, how they took part in this chapter of the great experiment. And there's that tension again, between my regard and curiosity for that ingenuity and for the costs incurred by that kind of progress. So for example, the way we grow food. It's a grand, enormous feat. It requires immense sacrifice on the part of farmers and those who toil on farms. It involves some of humanity's most elaborate technological innovation. Contemporary agriculture sustains us, while many practices are destroying the planet. I think some experts have suggested that we have somewhere between 80 and 100 harvests left if we continue treating topsoil the way that we do. So also Mount Rushmore, another example, is 95 parts ridiculous. It's an offensive desecration, and maybe 5 parts impressive. I'm not suggesting, nor do I mean to suggest, that we should spend time redeeming such things. Rather, that some of us would do well to see the complexities of the larger pictures that these things represent, including myself. We are capable of holding conflicting and complex truths, even though recent executive orders suggest that we are not. So as the work went on, I believed that I was choosing technology specifically for the historic impact that those machines represented. But looking back, I see that I was also using the machines as stand-ins for the body or for human experience. And I had also been using natural elements, plants, clouds, waves, etc., as a way to destabilize symbols of power. So Calgary-based writer Jessie Bryant had this to say about the work, and she does a better job of explaining it than I do. Binaries course through text and image in You Are Needed. That's the name of the exhibition. Beyond the thematic coupling of animal and machine, violent and bucolic, and individual and institution, we discover other underlying dyads, such as that between strength and insecurity. Underneath the bold semblances of power and perfection lay tinges of vulnerability, which leaks through in words like loss, question, demobilized, and reduced, and in the unusual pairings of slogans and images that evoke inquiry rather than certainty. I think these 2 pieces and the previous 2 pieces were generated from my attraction to a few different types of power. And the text is taken from contemporary armed forces recruitment slogans that are pretty much, they're just poetry. They're like car ads that kind of wax poetic about the kind of person we want to be and don't tell us anything about what we're actually buying or getting into. So while a lot of the posters rely on these very masculine tropes of solidity and certitude, many also contain elements of impermanence and decay, or even the feminine, fertility, nature, even growth. So both image and text serve to denude the masculine thrust, in this case of rocket or jet propulsion, exposing instead a decidedly feminine chalice form on the right and an exposed, very fecund corporeal rocket on the left. So both works originate in this multifaceted story of human achievement, emblematic of the brilliance of human ingenuity, shrouded by a romanticized past, leaving lasting legacies of harm. And I used to, before I started making more work, when I talk about these posters, kind of go through these stories of the V2 rocket engine on the left, and how that was developed during World War II, and the first jet engine, the Manhattan Project. So like the history of the rocket engine, nuclear fission, the jet engine, the Manhattan Project, and agriculture, stories rich with dissonance and contradictions, the settlement of this continent, on an individual familial scale, at least for those that settled, was a harrowing experience that required resilience, it required fortitude, and a deep desire to establish a better life for one's family, for posterity. But the conditions of this immigration and our expansion here are textbook settler colonialism, inseparable from colonial genocide. So parallel threads like this so often course through American and Canadian history, and it has at times felt like an unstable or kind of perilous platform to build a studio practice. But these truths that seem at odds are particularly prickly for some North American settlers, as many of us cling to a romantic attachment to land ownership as a birthright that our ancestors sought for us. I don't know that my work can encourage people to hold conflicting realities, but it's good to have goals. A friend of mine sent me a text about this piece. He said, "It has the vague, purposeless slogan that suggests responsible and sensible management of limitless material, time, and space, with the work hard, play hard absurdity of a white guy in a funny hat proving himself on the back of some livestock." This series looks at some of the implications of living on territory governed by treaties between the Crown and Indigenous people. The forces that have shaped this continent for my predecessors, from the creation of highways and railways to resource extraction, massive power generating projects, these manifestations of progress have been created through or by my government by way of treaties, sometimes in spite of them, and on behalf of supposedly all of us. So the object behind the cowboy is a Francis turbine. It's the turbine design used in many of Canada's large hydroelectric projects, and the text is a phrase about His or Her Majesty that appears in treaties 1 through 11 that cover territory from Ontario all the way to the Northwest Territories. The technology in this series represents those industries: mining, forestry, power generation, industries that can be seen as economically stimulating, sustainable, job creators, important especially in regions that struggle economically. They're also violations of the environment and the people who rely on it. So some of the treaties in question are also meant to be covenants for all of us, especially those in the region where I live. So when I travel across Mi'kma'ki, when I flip on a light switch, when I purchase land, I'm essentially exercising a treaty right. I'm part of this equation as a beneficiary, not a bystander. So Canada's mid-20th century nation-shaping project was also largely supported and illustrated by graphic art. Initial efforts to graft an image onto Canada as a vast, uninhabited landscape in need of rugged European stewardship can be easily found in the posters and advertisements of the recent past, along with many other Canadian ideas and ideals like that of hardy, brawny, but resourceful masculinity, adventuresome determination and resourcefulness. Heteronormative patriarchal families are the right stewards for this land. Whether in advertisements or iconic national treasures like the Group of Seven, territory and wilderness are shown to exist as pristine or pastoral sites, an inheritance for us, a gross oversimplification full of omission. They contain the seeds of stewardship also. Stewardship is an important concept, one that at least symbolically many Canadians take to heart, as so much of Canadian visual culture supports this connection to wilderness and rugged outdoorsmanship. So these compositions combine Kaplan turbines and Francis turbines with text from what are called modern-day treaties or land claim agreements written collaboratively between Indigenous leadership and the Canadian government. And they're seen as a step in a better direction, but imperfect nonetheless. So not unlike hydroelectric power, which is immense and impressive, this undertaking, it provides renewable energy, but also has a devastating impact on the land and those that it nourishes. So the text and image here are representing powerful forces of progress or perhaps mismatched solutions that have been forced together by the depredation of my predecessors. So the use of treaty language is an attempt to isolate some of the problematically vague and magniloquent language that governs Canadians' relationships to territory. These founding documents, as well as illustrated and written propaganda, marketing language, political rhetoric, are bedfellows that have shaped my place here. I've read what others have had to say about this work. I've spoken about it. We've had a few interesting things to say. Nonetheless, I don't know that this work really does a lot to forward the work of settler responsibility necessarily. I think they're a continuation of past work through yet another lens, and I'd really like to come back here. I'm not saying that this work was a failure. I think at least graphically, they're doing some really good things, but this feels, it feels unresolved. This companion series looks at British, American, and Canadian mechanizations that represent progress and power. The ghost figures are directly appropriated from the graphic artworks and political cartoons that shape public opinion in support of these industries. I do have political opinions. I think you're probably picking up on a few of them, but I'm not interested in articulating them with my work. I'm obviously critical of accepting rhetoric that neatly packages singular frameworks and discourages divergent thinking, unless it's artwork that I agree with, that is agitation propaganda. I just told on myself. I'm not a hypocrite. I'm a hypocrite. I hope that this work, in its refusal to incite derision or agitation, and in its refusal to entice anyone to patriot love, can make a little bit of room for both. And perhaps if both can be felt, there exists a kernel of responsibility that we could recognize ourselves as being both part of a solution and part of a problem. And I think that sounds a little silly. It's good to have goals with our artwork, but so it's been interesting to connect Canadian and American colonial expansion and imperial aggression. Canada does not have a torch-bearing woman, but it does have guided missiles, a landscape carved through with railroads and plowed furrows of earth. It also has a history with firearms that, yes, is not as enthusiastically entrenched as America's, but we do have mass shootings and we have gun violence. When I talk to Canadians about this work, I've noticed either a buzzing enthusiasm about drawing those parallels with us or a real reluctance on behalf of settler folks to see those parallels between their nation and their nation state's history and that of their bombastic and violent southern neighbor. This kind of absolution through relativism is alluring. It's lazy, and it's a type of social negligence, in my humble opinion. I think that's the only soapbox that I'm going to stand on tonight. The next few slides are pairing of a few of my historical favorites, works that could be seen as representing Ellul's definition of agitation on the left and integration on the right. So while on opposite ends of those spectrums, many of the illustrative and textual strategies used in these works are attempting to seduce and compel us by poking at those similar nerves. They all contain figures as subjects. And my work doesn't really, or I'll get into that in a minute. The contemporary versions of these works are the photographs and video clips that make their way to our news media, all the appeals to charity that orbit around our social media platforms, images of imperiled refugees, the victims of genocidal wars, or even our noble troops. Whether photographic or hand-drawn, contemporary or historic, agitation or integration, images are still very much put to work. Often their intentions are to define shared identity within a community or a population, or to evoke sympathy for others by showing us our shared humanity. I'm inclined to avoid using figures in my work unless they are allegorical figures, so symbols like cowboys, ladies from antiquity like Temperance, Columbia, and Britannia. Depicting victims or service members has always felt off limits. Those are not my stories to share. But there's one story arc that feels close enough to home. And so this series, body of work is ongoing. It's currently using the platform of the poster a little differently. So during America's war with North Vietnam, my father worked on the flight deck of an aircraft carrier stationed in the Gulf of Tonkin. He held the most dangerous job in the Navy outside of active enemy engagement scenarios. This work can be seen dramatically set to Danger Zone in the opening sequence to both Top Gun movies. The imagery in this series is pulled directly from my father's photographs of V2 Division's flight deck operations. So it began in my head as a gathering of files, documents, photos, letters, and items. I've been doing this for years, working on these posters. But about a year or so before Ken Burns and Lynn Novick released their Vietnam War documentary, I started also compiling and thinking about, I think I'm ready to make work about this. So years before that documentary series was released, I began hoping that Burns, this famed teller of American stories, was going to give us the gift of insights or closure that other filmmakers, authors, and politicians have been unable to do. Perhaps some kind of salve for this still raw war that continues to haunt us. And it's embarrassing to admit this. It's embarrassing that I was naive enough to want a sparkle of redemptive wisdom. That's the very thing that my studio work has set about to challenge, the absurdity of neatly packaging or the danger of abridging difficult histories. So I watched all 18 hours twice. The film did absolutely none of what I had hoped for, obviously. And so alongside seeking out primary sources and material and reviewing this chapter yet again, I spent a lot of time recalling my father telling my 9-year-old self about all the yellow ribbons that were welcoming home the Gulf War vets and how gutted and betrayed him and his fellows felt by this completely polar display of reverence and respect for returning veterans, and how 20 years prior, those returning from service in Southeast Asia at best were met with silence. At 9 years old, I don't think I probably reciprocated in that conversation, but I do wonder if I asked him any questions. I was probably 13 or 14 when him and I started watching MASH every night. For years, we did this. I think we got through all 11 seasons. And afterwards, my dad would sit in his big recliner chair and share stories or anecdotes that now looking back, I see were riddled with his unresolved relationship with that war and a desire to share it. I think I was a safe target. Perhaps, though, he thought there was something there for me. He was a sensitive man. He was a thinking man. He was a teacher and an author. The bond he formed with his Navy brothers, the pride he took in the dangerous work he did, was in conflict with his shame for having a direct hand in Operation Rolling Thunder, which obliterated tens of thousands of Vietnamese combatants and civilians, and is still blowing them up today when their farm and construction equipment runs into unexploded ordnances. And so this work began from the residue that he left. I'm calling this series Yankee Station, named for the area in the Gulf of Tonkin in the South China Sea, where the US carrier groups and some Australian ships set up shop during Operation Rolling Thunder. My father was a catapult operator. In his words, he hurled fighter jets off of aircraft carriers and then caught them. If I understand Garfield minus Garfield correctly, it is meant to reveal the existential angst of John Arbuckle, a journey into the mind of an isolated everyman battling loneliness and inner turmoil. Men on flight decks without the massive warship, without the dramatic music of Top Gun, men without fighter jets, just uniforms, labor, and bold gestures. So isolating the text used in this series came from months, like I said, of reading transcripts of the Winter Soldier testimonies, old military pamphlets, newspaper clippings, my dad's editorial articles, the Pentagon Papers, conversations between Lyndon Johnson and Robert McNamara, poetry written by servicemen and women. I'm less interested in commemorating or conveying my father's experience as I am experimenting with the rhetoric of the time and how current it still is, the words of that war. So if you can see, the dark text behind the red stuff says, this is not a change of purpose. It is a change in what we believe that purpose requires, which feels extremely current. I'm especially interested in the ways that the male body has been used as a prop to invoke a range of reactions to stereotypical masculinity. The male laborer's body and the male serviceman's body is held up in propaganda to elicit a sense of stoic pride in those who can identify with him, hopefully both men and women, a sense of security and adoration for those who culture tells to look to him for protection. He is used to incite longing and even guilt in men who are not aligned with his commitment to duty or his rugged work. They're also homoerotic. We are to see him as our own, the spirit of the great American or Canadian male, living out his birthrights, keeping us safe, working hard, building the country. Effective propaganda, but also effective in carrying forward limited range that masculinity has been plagued with. So in most of the pieces, the words of politicians or that state-sponsored integration propaganda is printed directly on the paper. And the words from the more human side are glued over the top and sanded back. So the words, things that my father had written, some of the correspondence between some of his Navy buddies and myself. So possible analogies in this interference of different voices seem kind of obvious. The competing narratives that are present in those who serve, the constant revision and redirection that colors the outward face of wartime propaganda, the absurdity of choosing slogans to give a voice to the narratives of these people. I wanted these works to express some of the vulnerabilities underlying a graphic tradition, an ideology that extols certain types of work and male labor as acceptable summaries of multinational, multi-generational ambitions and conflicts, but also of the individual lives that fueled them. I seem to be insisting that I can work through layers of personal family stuff while presenting something unrelated or related, but altogether different to you as viewers. Am I deliberately attempting to make work that is for me one thing and another for viewers? I think we all do this to an extent, but it's not always deliberate. So I'm not sure. It's an incomplete series. I have about 15 more of these ready to print. but I'm hesitating to finish. I think it still feels really raw. I think it's also very specific, and I think it needs a specific audience. So great coincidence, a few years ago, I was invited to speak at a symposium down in Corpus Christi, Texas. It was also the same weekend that the USS Coral Sea was having its annual reunion. So I got to meet a bunch of the guys that were on the flight deck with my dad at the same time. And they remembered him, and I shared his articles with them. And we talked about their work. Maybe this is the audience. So right now, a current body of work began from a desire to carve into wood, to wrestle with a way of creating imagery that required some capitulation to a sometimes unforgiving material. I also wanted to work a bit larger and a bit quicker. At least I thought that's what was going to happen. I also began with a piece of literature written in 1889, and I first encountered it, I think, around 2015. Just doing the regular kind of field work and reading that I do in support of the posters. But I began carrying around the first paragraph of this text in my wallet. And admittedly, that's not really a thing we were doing in 2015, carrying around pieces of short stories from 18th and 19th century literature. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I just know that it really, really resonated. So Ambrose Bierce's Chickamauga is a story set one particular afternoon in 1863 in the life of a young child, a 6-year-old. Bierce was a writer, a journalist, a poet. He was a member of the Anti-Imperial League, and a Civil War veteran. So this story, Chickamauga, is about a lot of things. The narrative follows this young boy growing up south of Chattanooga during the Civil War. He's playing outside, and he ends up on a bit of an adventure. And I'll read the paragraph to you. One sunny autumn afternoon, a child strayed away from its rude home in a small field and entered a forest unobserved. It was happy in a new sense of freedom from control, happy in the opportunity of exploration and adventure, for this child's spirit, in bodies of its ancestors, had for thousands of years been trained to memorable feats of discovery and conquest. Victories in battles whose critical moments were centuries, whose victors' camps were cities of hewn stone. From the cradle of its race, it had conquered its way through 2 continents, and passing a great sea, had penetrated a 3rd, there to be born to war and dominion as heritage. I've named this series of large-scale woodcuts the Heritage Collection, which is a perversion of marketing strategies in which products are sold under the umbrella of timelessness, heirloom quality, and other vacuous nods to wholesome and robust values, wrapped as they are in the inevitable financial transaction. So think Pendleton or Hudson's Bay or even American Girl dolls attempting to imbue objects with romance as if they could sell us a national treasure. So while this title betrays my cynicism, I do actually imagine this series as an inheritance for my children. I have a 4- and 7-year-old. And when I'm working on this work, they comment on it. They have a sort of passing interest, and I've been telling them, like, this is for you. You'll have one of each of these when you're older, and they don't seem to care. In addition to our family albums, multi-generational china sets, strange keepsakes from foreign wars, heirloom objects, I bequeath to them this collection of explosions. So all the images are woodcut interpretations of explosions created by either Americans or Canadians since the War of the American Revolution. So the sources are archive photographs, engravings, chromolithographs, woodcuts, video stills, images of explosions created by those who were either paving the way for my existence here, testing new weapons, protecting our freedoms, extracting resources, or the result of accidents caused by corner cutting and cost saving. My children will be raised in comfort and with stories about their grandparents and great-grandparents as generous, hardworking people. Grandparents, yeah, well, my kids will be raised in Canada. They'll be a little further from that swirling patriotism that uses our military history as its platform. The nation-state of Canada does use its military to promote national identity and pride, but it leans very heavily on the peacekeeping myth that makes it palatable. I'd like for my children to also know that this is their heritage and that it is shared between these nations, albeit the difference in volume or tonality. In this series currently on view in Hamilton, Ontario, I've highlighted specifically Canadian content featuring a crude oil train derailment, military operations in Iraq, weapons testing in Ontario, and open pit mining in Alberta. So don't let that peaceful northern neighbor myth fool you. We have a lot of kilotons. This is currently how our, at the time, 4-year-old was being introduced to the benevolent peacekeeping mission of Canada's military. Whatever quiet pride I have for these two men is outshadowed by my utter bewilderment in this apparently commonplace exercise of practicing Remembrance Day or Veterans Day with preschoolers. Bierce's story goes on to describe how this child found themselves in the midst of one of the Civil War's deadliest battles. The author suggested that the engraved images illustrating historic battles found in its father's books taught it about the postures and heroics of soldiers. The young child made its way through the woods with a wooden sword, mimicking what he saw in those old prints. It was a year ago that my children first emerged from the woods by our house with wooden swords. Chickamauga was written 140 years ago. How much has changed in the condition of their birth? Also, why did I provide their school with these photos when I was asked? I didn't know they were going to do this with it. But they do this every year now. We get one of these, comes home with my child every year, along with these interesting activity booklets featuring Canada's forces. Prior to the first child being born, I'd been thinking about my role and how they'll learn about their heritage. How will I introduce American stories to these two Canadian children? Can I introduce what was missing when I learned about my ancestors and my nation's history? Can I frame the stories differently and change the lens without forcing my ideological perspective? I want to be careful when it comes to introducing concepts to children when they're delivered with a caregiver's fraught emotions. These things have a way of being inscribed very deeply. This can go a bit sideways. When my father's professions, way back then, when he was talking to me about those returning Gulf War veterans or talking to me after MASH, were those a gift of honesty? Were they an acceptable truth-telling about a painful world that children should not be shielded from? Or was it a selfish sloughing off of emotions that he was uncomfortable sharing with adults? Maybe neither, maybe both. Whatever it was, it became really lodged in there, and it's become a part of my story, shaping my relationship with my national identity for decades. And in what ways might this reality of our birth shape my children? How might I model intergenerational responsibility for them beyond truth-telling? Perhaps I can find a graceful way to introduce our difficult histories by giving them a fertile setting to ask questions. From the cradle of its race, it had conquered its way through 2 continents, and passing a great sea had penetrated a 3rd, there to be born to war and dominion as a heritage. So in recent exhibitions of this work, I show a selection of the woodcuts with segments from Bierce's Chickamauga made by diffusing soot and smoke through a stencil. The story really beautifully and horrifically attempts to explain how it is that violent birthrights are passed down to children through national mythologies and perhaps even through blood. This work has engendered questions about how beauty functions when portraying horrific realities. Maybe this is another way to approach that idea of holding conflicting truths. Perhaps beauty can function the way humor does with dark subject matter, allowing us to stay a bit longer than we might have otherwise, helping us to see common chords instead of looking away. And using the original medium of printed propaganda, the original medium, the woodcut, as with lithographs, I am again attempting to at least partially place myself further back in time to be in concert with a method of making that shaped consciousness, that didn't tell full truths, but that provided a blueprint for my ancestors to comprehend and get behind a shared connection to the human pursuit of destroying towns, cities, farms, and flesh. When beginning to plan for this project with IEA, I returned to the American Civil War, and it's not a stretch today to feel that chapter of our history, to feel it a bit more deeply in this polarized moment. The steel and wood engravings created for the popular pictorial press at the time are beautiful artifacts to behold despite their slant. So I began sifting through archives with large scans of Civil War era prints and drawings. Many of the images I'm appropriating for this project are works created for Frank Leslie's Pictorial newspaper, which was a competitor of Harper's Weekly and the New York Illustrated News. So all 3 of those publications were turning sketches sent in by artists who were sketching in the battlefield or very close to the battlefield. They would send in their sketches, and then wood engravers, a team of wood engravers would interpret them, and then that would be disseminated widely with stories that accompanied them so that the general population could see what was going on. So those images shaped the home front's understanding of how that war was being fought and how valiant was their cause. So I prepared files for Brigg and Miles to laser engrave into 4 20 by 30-inch blocks of Baltic birch. I left some spaces in these files blank so that I could carve into the images, to mingle my marks with these historic colloquial prints, to have a physically reductive line-based dialogue with historic engravers. These engravers were not working as individual artists. They completed this work as teams of laborers, some with specializations in figures, some specialized in foliage, others in water, architecture, etc. Sometimes they were even women. These were not people that witnessed battle. They were translating a romanticized or dramatized firsthand account into a network of dashes and swelling lines. And why are clouds so seductive? Why am I drawn to them? Why are we drawn to them? Big cumulonimbus clouds or explosions? Why are conflagrations fascinating? Why do we watch fire? Is it also the purview of someone living on a continent far removed from bombing campaigns to be so captivated and awed? Such imagery inevitably signifies different things for different people. And I've already kind of spoiled that experience by projecting all of my personal narratives in this talk. But yeah, I'm curious how you would regard, if you could pretend that you saw this work in a gallery without me talking about it. I'm really interested in how others are regarding and experiencing this work. So I left, I think, like, I don't know, do we call these Easter eggs on the bottom left corner and the bottom right corner? This is just a digital collage in this stage. So on the left is my interpretation of an artist's interpretation, Alfred Wode's interpretation of one of John Brown's caves. John Brown was a white abolitionist that kind of kicked off, it's a really long story, that kind of kicked off the Civil War when he raided Harper's Ferry. And then the image on the right is a section of a photo from the January 6th insurrection. I have photos of this, the January 6th insurrections. So I don't know, arches, doorways, I don't know what that's doing. Yeah, that's what we're up to. Come check us out. Come to the 4th floor. We're making decisions. We're printing some colors into these things. So as soon as I get home, though, I'm going to keep plugging away on these 2 8 by 4 foot carvings with the intention of incorporating a full range of color. So I'm using some of what we're doing upstairs as a bit of a test run too, to see, like, can this work with woodcuts? To add these different layers of color to make them seem a bit more painterly. A lot of the times those images from Frank Leslie's or Harper's would go into people's homes and they would hand color them themselves and cut them out of the magazine and put them up on the wall. So I'm going to keep plugging away at these. Originally, when I thought, oh yeah, I got to work really big, let's do 8 feet. Should they be monumental, historic explosions? Perhaps the first detonation of an atomic weapon, or the Halifax explosion, maybe the Oklahoma City bombing. But what eventually rang more true to the spirit of this work, or at least my shifting relationship with it, was to focus on unintended destruction, so accidents. And there's like an undeniable ubiquity of devastation that comes from strategical errors, poor choices in a world that's saturated with combustible fuel and massive arsenals. So this image is of a fire aboard the USS Forrestal, which is another carrier stationed out in Yankee Station near where my dad was. My grandparents, his parents, had collected an impressive amount of clippings about this accident. So when we were going through their stuff, I found this stack of newspaper articles about the Forrestal. I mean, does one not watch the news pretty closely when your child is stationed overseas? This collection of their clippings is really all I have left of how I would interpret what their home front experience would have been like. So 134 sailors and aviators were killed, 161 injured, when old, corroded, leaky, volatile Korean War-era bombs, which were being used to save money, set off a massive cascade of explosions and fires from the jet fuel. I think these works coalesced around this slow burning realization that began in my late 20s, when I started realizing that there's no guarantee that there will be grown-ups in charge. I think Gen Z is realizing this much earlier than I did. In a world where people and institutions who are meant to provide order, structure, to advance our condition are often threatening the opposite of the very thing that they've been tasked with doing. I mean, sometimes they're holding it down, but we're also really seeing a lot of failure right now. Is it the fault of individuals stuck in patriarchal systems of leadership and management with no room to say, I need help, I need experts, or let's solve this together? Or is it the rabid economic culture, which is ever more concerned with more efficient, quicker, cheaper? Obviously, it's both of those things. We blame it on individuals, but it's really a soup of systemic failure. So in 2013, a train carrying 70 cars full of crude oil derailed in the middle of Lac-Mégantic, a small town in Quebec. 47 people were killed and 3/4 of the town was destroyed. Some more. Dark stuff. So I was supposed to set my timer. I don't know how long I've been talking. I'm going to finish up here just in the next few slides. Going back a couple years, back while I was doing these lithographic posters, I felt I was missing a key target audience. I really enjoyed reactions from people who did happen to see the posters, who were people that had who had experience in industry, who were perhaps service members, farmers, people who had firsthand experience with some of the things I was depicting. Those reactions and that feedback was really valuable to me. And I want to intersect with those folks who live and work in rural areas, people who grew up the way that I did. These are people that, like my family and I, had limited access to art, aren't showing up in art galleries very much. So I was recalling the advertisements on murals and barn silos where I grew up, and the tobacco ads on barn roofs that dotted the rural Tennessee landscape where I had spent some time. I did my grad work at the University of Tennessee-Knoxville. So these spaces couldn't be further from the metropolitan art galleries, but they're places that are connected to my origins. And what if talking to my people through artwork that functions democratically, maybe diplomatically even, what if that had potential to disrupt polarization, or maybe at the very least to provoke some interesting conversations? So aside from the obvious reliance on visual language of 20th century advertisements, the murals take inspiration from the multifaceted, often contentious, sometimes hopeful developments in land management in the ag industry on this continent. So since the first mural began, which was 2016, there have been a lot of really interesting conversations, and not just in my orbit, but ones that I'm hearing about secondhand. Conversations between the farmers and their customers, their butchers, their employees, between neighbors in the region. So for over 9 years, these barns have been sparking dialogue about soil health, about climate change, but also the role of art and the value of art in rural places. So the relational life of this work has been its strength. And it doesn't slot very easily into an academic CV, but it's the most impactful work that I've made, and I intend to continue with. So if any of you have any leads on barns, please, DM me later or come up and talk to me after this. I'd like to bring these from Atlantic Canada into the States, westward into Canada. These murals are created in the agricultural region where I live. The images are informed by conversations with the farmers. The text comes from local history. So each of them has quite a lengthy story that I don't know that I have time for. So this one in particular, some of the imagery is borrowed from the industry's answers to questions of how to maintain and care for soil, from the use of red clover as a nitrogen-fixing cover crop to advancements in low tillage technology. The text is borrowed from the 19th century motto of the Kings County Agricultural Society, be industrious that you may live. So somewhere between being a message of hope and a warning, I imagine that no matter how a viewer reads and understands that motto, the imagery can hint at some of the threads between the past and our current realities. This one just finished up this summer at the Lohr family farm. What's great about these two is the relationships that built between myself and the emerging artists that I'm hiring, especially between those emerging artists as they spend 10 hours a day with one another, trapped on this staging, painting around these like terrible corrugations of the metal. They're learning about agriculture, they're connecting with the farmers, they're connecting with local artists. And so the text, it says, this piece says, this of storied past and comfortable present, there trembles a minor strain. It's actually a combination of two phrases from early 20th century, one from an early 20th century poet and one from a mid 20th century historian. it's a long story. We can, if you want to go there in the Q&A, we totally can. But in the mid-90s, my father began writing a syndicated editorial column appearing in a few dozen Midwestern newspapers. His aim was to distill emerging agriscience research so that lay people could understand it and so that they could see the importance of the developments and debates that impact how our food is grown. So there's this interesting continuum here. I didn't make the connection immediately, but it seems that both of us really hope to bring topics around food production and land management to people's living rooms, and perhaps me, like people's cars, as I love the idea that people are just driving along, expecting to see the pastoral landscape laying out before them, and then, you know, crest a hill or drive down the road and see these things that seem a bit out of place. And it's similar to how when I was in graduate school, I tried to, I did actually, I was successfully like wheat pasted a bunch of those lithographs in a bunch of the cities, like when I was traveling between Knoxville and Milwaukee or Knoxville and Montana, I'd stop in St. Louis or Kansas City. And then these things would show up, these wheat pasted posters would show up in public spaces. And people would comment about them in different social media sites and Flickr accounts and the, what's that archive, that big archive of street art. And people would have no idea, like, what is going on here? Like, I saw this thing pop up in my neighborhood. What does it mean? So the dialogue was really, really funny to watch from a distance when you don't have that context of going into an art gallery and making the assumptions that we make when we go into an art gallery. I think the work can really function very differently. So yeah, I wanted to create that in a larger way. I chose that one specifically, Brig, because it's just awful, but really kind of cute too. So there's lots more there, but that seems like a really good time to, to open it up to questions, comments. I know it's sometimes difficult to come up with a question when sometimes it's just observations. I definitely welcome those too. Thank you.